Welcome to Matthew 24, part 9. Luke 21 verse 24, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Well, this is exactly what happened. They fell by the sword. They fell by the sword within the city. They murdered and butchered each other, and then they were slain without the city by the Romans. And at the end of things, those that survived were led away captive and taken throughout the Roman Empire. They fell by the edge of the sword, they were taken away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem was trodden down of the Gentiles. Thomas Newton says, the number of those who, quote, fell by the edge of the sword, end quote, was indeed very great. Of those who perished during the whole siege, there were, as Josephus saith, 1,100,000. That's 1.1 million. Many were also slain at other times and in other places. By the commander Florus, who was the first author of the war, there were slain at Jerusalem 3,600. By the inhabitants of Caesarea above 20,000, at Scythopolis above 13,000, at Ascalon 2,500, at Ptolemais 2,000, at Alexandria under Tiberius Alexander the President 50,000, at Joppa when it was taken by Cestius Gallus 8,400, in a mountain called Azamon near Sepphoris above 2,000, at Damascus 10,000, in a battle with the Romans at Ascalon 10,000, and Thomas Newton goes on and lists many, many more. Thomas Newton continues, besides these, many of every age, sex and condition were slain in this war who were not reckoned. But of these who are reckoned, the number amounts to above 1,357,660, which would appear almost incredible if their own historian had not so particularly enumerated them. Luke 21 verse 24 also says, and they shall be led away captive into all nations. Again, from Josephus, we learn that the number of those that were carried away captive, in accordance with the prophecy, they shall be taken captive into all nations. He says during this whole war was collected to be 97,000. Alford says the robbers and seditious were all punished with death. The tallest and most beautiful youths, together with several of the Jewish nobles, were reserved by Titus to grace his triumphal entry into Rome. After this selection, all above the age of 17 were sent in chains into Egypt to be employed there as slaves or distributed throughout the empire to be sacrificed as gladiators in the amphitheatres, whilst those who were under this age were exposed to sale. On the next page he says, of the two great leaders of the Jews, who had both been made prisoners, John was doomed to a dungeon for life, while Simon, after being led together with John in triumph at Rome, was scourged and put to death as a malefactor. Jesse Lyman Helbert says, Vespasian, the leading Roman general, led a great army into Palestine, but was called to Rome to take the imperial throne, and left the conduct of the war to his son Titus. After a terrible siege, made more terrible by starvation and civil strife within the walls, the city was taken and destroyed. Untold thousands were enslaved. The Colosseum at Rome was built by the forced labour of the Jewish captives, multitudes being literally worked to death. The Jewish state, after an existence of 13 centuries, was annihilated and has never yet been restored. In the fall of Jerusalem, few, if any, Christians perished. Here we see a picture of the Arch of Titus built in the 1st century AD to commemorate his victory against the Jews, and on this you can see, among other things, the menorah, which is the 7-branched golden candlestick taken from the temple and brought back to Rome. The fact that this victory is marked by a triumphal arch also points to its importance. This was not a back-of-the-shed brawl with a disgruntled tenant or vassal state. So it is abundantly clear that they, the Jews, fell by the edge of the sword and were led away captive into all nations. Verse 24 also says, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. In its immediate context, this is referring to the First Jewish-Roman War or Rebellion from 66 to 70 AD, when the city was levelled and not one stone of the temple was left upon another. The word for trodden here is the Greek word patio, which means to trample or tread underfoot. In the lexicon found at blueletterbible.org of this word, it says, outline of biblical usage: to tread, to trample, crush with the feet, to advance by setting foot upon, tread upon, to encounter successfully the greatest perils from the machinations and persecutions with which Satan would fain thwart the preaching of the gospel, and also to tread underfoot, trample on, that is, to treat with insult and contempt, to desecrate the holy city by devastation and outrage. More broadly speaking, of course, Jerusalem in fact had been subject to foreign rule, which is also a treading down of the Gentiles since 604 BC, when the Babylonians captured it, and it didn't become liberated from foreign control until the descendants of ancient Israel, as seen in the modern day British and Allied forces during World War I, which liberated it from Turkish Ottoman control at the end of 1917. I'm mentioning this here because this fulfilled a separate aspect of Bible prophecy relating to Jerusalem being in the hands of Gentiles, but starting with the Babylonians and extending for 7 times, which in Bible prophecy is a period of 2,520 years. As a rule, only those who understand historicism will appreciate what I am saying here. So for everyone else, for more specific information on this, please see my Revelation Remastered series, Revelation 16, the Euphrates, parts 2 and 3 in particular. To be clear, I am now of the opinion that Luke 21 verse 24 has its fulfillment in the 1st century AD with the destruction of Jerusalem. However, to be equally clear, this is not the only place in the Word of God that deals with the subjugation of Jerusalem, it being placed in the hands of the Gentiles. There is a grand overarching prophecy that sits on top of this, and for those details, please see my Revelation series, as I've just mentioned. In addition, I will add that the situation with modern-day Jerusalem is quite complicated and one that requires a lot of careful thought and searching of the scriptures and history. The fact that the land, Jerusalem, Palestine, was subsequently wrested from the hands of the British by Idumean Ashkenazim Jews in 1948 is also the subject of another aspect of Bible prophecy. It's all there, but to me it appears that only a very few people are aware of these things, with the majority blindly believing that the Jews of today are the Israel people of the scriptures and that they have a mandate from heaven to occupy the land and to destroy their neighbours. This is a corruption of the Word of God. It is a complete misunderstanding of Bible prophecy. Now let's go to "except those days be shortened." Matthew 24 verse 22, "And except those days should be shortened, there shall be no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened." The general church understanding of this verse appears to be that this can only apply to the atomic age, that is the 20th century and beyond nowadays, where nuclear weapons have been developed which have the capability of destroying the entire world several times over, such that no flesh would be saved alive. And so this has to be what Jesus is referring to. But the facts are that nothing has changed in this discourse from Jesus. He is still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and this entire event brought in the land of Judea roundabout. And Jesus is saying that unless these days are shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days would be shortened. Now, this should come as no surprise, as we have already seen the shocking horrors of this war and the siege of Jerusalem. Clearly, had it continued longer, no one would have been saved alive. As well, it would doubtless have spilled over to the other regions round about, as wars generally do. And if this occurred, it would imperil the elect, that is, the saved, those that believed and had followed Jesus Christ and were obedient to his word and that had fled the city. Jesus said those days would be shortened. Wonderful. As well, we should note that Judea as a whole was not a safe place to be in. Though the Christians had fled Jerusalem, yet a danger to them remained as long as the war was ongoing. For their sakes it was necessary that those days be shortened and the final strike at the Jewish kingdom come to a speedy end. Josephus says, "Nor was there not any part of Judea that was not in a miserable condition, as well as its most eminent city also." Concerning this verse, Adam Clarke says, Josephus computes the number of those who perished in the siege at 1,100,000, besides those who were slain in other places. And then he says, "And if the Romans had gone on destroying in this manner, the whole nation of the Jews would, in a short time, have been entirely extirpated." Thomas Newton writes how that the effects of the war had spilled over into other areas. He says, "At Antioch, the Jews, being falsely accused of a design to burn the city, many of them were burnt in the theatre, and others were slain. The Romans pursued, and took and slew them everywhere, as particularly at the siege of Machaerus, at the wood Jades, where the Jews were surrounded, and none of them escaped, but being not fewer than 3,000 were all slain, and at Masada, where being closely besieged, and upon the point of being taken, they first murdered their wives and children, and then themselves, to the number of 960, to prevent their falling into enemy hands. When Judea was totally subdued, the danger extended to those who dwelt at a distance. Many were slain in Egypt, and their temple there was shut up. And in Cyrene, the followers of Jonathan, a weaver and author of new disturbances, were most of them slain. He himself was taken prisoner, and by his false accusation 3,000 of the richest Jews were condemned and put to death." Thomas Newton says, "Nothing so violent can be of long continuance. These calamities were so severe that, like fire, they must in time have consumed all, and have left nothing for themselves to prey upon. And if the Romans had gone on destroying in this manner, the whole nation of the Jews would certainly in a little time have been extirpated." And then, speaking of the elect, the Christians, Thomas Newton says, "The fury of the zealots on one hand, and hatred of the Romans on the other, and partly through the difficulty of subsisting in the mountains without houses or provisions, would in all probability have been almost all destroyed either by the sword or by famine, if the days had not been shortened. But providentially the days were shortened." Titus himself was desirous of putting a speedy end to the siege, having Rome and the riches and the pleasures there before his eyes. Some of his officers proposed to him to turn the siege into a blockade, and since they could not take the city by storm, to starve it into a surrender. But he thought it not becoming to sit still with so great an army. The besieged too helped to shorten the days by their divisions and mutual slaughters, by burning their provisions, which would have sufficed for many years, and by fatally deserting their strongest holds, where they could never have been taken by force, but by famine alone. By these means the days were shortened, and indeed otherwise Jerusalem could never have been taken in so short a time, so well fortified as it was, and so well fitted to sustain a longer siege. The enemy without could hardly ever have prevailed but for the factions and seditions within. Jew against Jew, they are contrary to all men, including being contrary to each other. Titus himself could not but ascribe his success to God as he was viewing the fortifications after the city was taken. His words to his friends were very remarkable. Quote, "We have fought," said he, with God on our side, and it is God who hath pulled the Jews out of these strongholds. For what could the hands of men or machines do against these towers?" End quote. To me, this is amazing. We can see the hand of our God everywhere. We have the prophecy and we have its clear fulfillment. Who can doubt the meaning of these things? Alford says concerning those days shall be shortened, and they were shortened accordingly. First, by the determination of Titus vigorously to push the siege by assault in opposition to the opinions of his officers, who recommended the more tedious plan of blockade. Secondly, by the conduct of the Jews themselves, who accelerated the capture of their city by intestine divisions and mutual slaughters, contrary to what is usual upon such emergencies, in which a common sense of danger ordinarily tends to unite contending parties against the common foe. Well, once again, the Jews are contrary to all men, so common sense went out of the window. Holford continues, thirdly, by the madness of the factions in burning storehouses full of provisions, and thus wasting the strength which was necessary for the defence of the place. Fourthly, by the extraordinary panic by which the Jews were seized when the Romans made their final attack on the higher city, in consequence of which they fled affrighted out of their strongholds, which Titus afterwards pronounced to be impregnable. And lastly, by the crowded state of the city during the siege, which, as we have before remarked, occasioned pestilential disorders and hastened the approach of famine. It's clear that those days were shortened. The siege could have gone on for years, but was ended in a few months. But there is yet more to add to this. Luke 19, verse 41, "And when he was come near, he beheld the city, and wept over it, saying, If thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes. For the days shall come upon thee, that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee, and they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation." That's the root cause. Because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation. The visitor, Jesus Christ, came, and they didn't receive him. They put him to death. Verse 43 of this chapter played a crucial role in shortening those days. "For the days shall come upon thee, that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side." Let's look at this. The trench referred to in verse 43 is not a trench like what we have seen in World War I and what we are seeing all the time in the current war in Ukraine. There are trenches everywhere. The Greek word used here is karax, I think that's how you say it, and it refers to a stake, by implication meaning a palisade, which is a wall made of stakes, which you might see around a Roman encampment. The word means a rampart, which is a military mound for circumvallation, meaning the surrounding of something, as in a siege. This is the trench that was built around Jerusalem. The fact that the prophecy of Jesus gives us details like this trench, which, to be clear, is a wall of circumvallation, is highly significant, for its construction directly aided in shortening the length of the siege. Prior to its construction, the Jews were able to easily leave the city and forage for food and supplies undetected for the most part, but now this became impossible, and so the famine within the city could not be mitigated in any way. This directly shortened those days. When we see a prophecy like this down to the finer details, it clearly establishes Jesus as that prophet that Moses spoke of, yea, and even more than this, as God he knoweth all things. Praise ye the Lord. From warhistoryonline.com we read the following article called "What was Circumvallation?" Of all the armies of the ancient world, the Romans did the most spectacular job of combining military might with engineering skill. This was repeatedly demonstrated in the forts, ramps, and assault devices they constructed when besieging a town or fort. The most impressive of all these tools was circumvallation. Circumvallation was the Roman practice of surrounding a settlement with a ring of defensive siege works. Unlike the blockade camp, its predecessor and the easier alternative, circumvallation created a complete encirclement, giving those surrounded no way in or out. Basically, then, circumvallation creates a fort around a fort. And what makes the circumvallation of Jerusalem so unique is that Titus constructed a 5-mile or 8-kilometer circumvallation wall within only 3 days. And this greatly discouraged the Jews within the city. Not only did this wall assist with hastening the taking of the city, but the landscape surrounding was ravaged. Every tree within 10 miles of Jerusalem was cut down. Josephus comments at the astonishing speed in which this wall of circumvallation was constructed. He says, "Now at this wall without were erected 13 places to keep garrisons in, whose circumferences put together amounted to 10 furlongs. The whole was completed in 3 days, so that what would naturally have required some months was done in so short an interval as is incredible." The construction of the wall of circumvallation, the siege engines, battering rams, crosses to crucify the Jews, meant that the countryside had been stripped bare. Josephus writes, "And now the Romans, although they were greatly distressed in getting together their materials, raised their banks in 21 days, after they had cut down all the trees that were in the country that adjoined to the city, and that for 90 furlongs round about." And truly, the very view itself was a melancholy thing, for those places which were adorned with trees and pleasant gardens were now become desolate country every way, and its trees were all cut down. Nor could any foreigner that had formerly seen Judea and the most beautiful suburbs of the city, and now saw it as a desert, but lament and mourn sadly at so great a change. For the war had laid all the signs of beauty quite waste, nor if anyone that had known the place before had come on a sudden to it now, would he have known it again. But though he were at the city itself, yet would he have inquired for it notwithstanding. Holford says, as no supplies whatever could now enter the walls, the famine rapidly extended itself, and, increasing in horror, devoured whole families. The tops of houses and the recesses of the city were covered with the carcasses of women, children, and aged men. The young men appeared like spectres in the places of public resort, and fell down lifeless in the streets. The dead were too numerous to be interred, and many expired in the performance of this office. The public calamity was too great for lamentation. Silence and, as it were, a black and deadly night overspread the city. But even such a scene could not awe the robbers. They spoiled the tombs and stripped the dead of their grave clothes with an unfeeling and wild laughter. They tried the edges of their swords on the carcasses, and even on some that were yet breathing. While Simon Gioras chose this melancholy and awful period to manifest the deep malignity and cruelty of his nature in the execution of the high priest Matthias and his 3 sons, whom he caused to be condemned as favourers of the Romans. The facts are clear. The city was extremely well fortified. Afterward, when Titus surveyed the city and its walls and its towers, he realized how impregnable it was, and he acknowledged the hand of God in bringing it to a swift end. For he said, quote, "It is God who hath pulled the Jews out of these strongholds, for what could the hands of men or machines do against these towers?" Number 2, Titus was desirous of a short siege, which was contrary to his officer's more tedious plan of blockade. Number 3, the Jews, contrary to all common sense, fought and murdered one another and burned their food supplies, which were sufficient for a prolonged siege. As well, the prophesied use of a wall of circumvallation, which would normally take months to construct, but which was built in an incredible 3 days, was also integral to shortening the siege. Had the First Jewish-Roman War been allowed to progress its natural path, it could have dragged on for years longer, the result of which would have been the killing of everyone in the city and round about, including the Christians who had fled Jewry and the city and went to the mountains and other places of refuge. But for their sakes those days were shortened, and everything about this event marks the hand of God in shortening those days. Praise the Lord. This is the end of part 9.